Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Hi everyone, this is just a very quick introduction for Jed Brubaker, who's going to be telling you a little bit about the research that we've been doing over this internship on Grindr and the act of leaving. Over to Jed.
Thanks. Thanks for everyone for showing up. It's hot and it's early. I want to start off by saying that while I'm the one who's presenting the work here, it was done it was part of a very collaborative project done with Mike and Annie and Kate Crawford, and as such, any brilliant thing that slips out of my mouth should be accredited to them, and conversely, insane moments are all on me. So we spent a lot of time talking about, in social media, talking about what the next great thing is. You know, Facebook, Foursquare, Instagram, Pinterest. You know, I laugh every time in my Google Reader when I get this, you know, update from Mashable saying 50 social media resources you may have missed. These come like once a week, and I don't know, I guess if there are 50 new things a week, then certainly I have missed some. And so while it's often acknowledged that people can't really keep up with all these systems, it's actually rarely researched. And so it's in this context that I want to present our study of leaving Grindr. Let's start by talking about what Grindr is. I want to set the stage a bit, and then we'll hop into what it actually means to leave. Grindr is one of this emerging category, is an app in this emerging category of location-based social media or social networking apps. There's an emerging set of research around these apps. They typically think in terms of location disclosure and privacy, the use of geolocation features such as on Facebook or on Twitter, and particularly some new work that's been coming out about location-based social media such as Foursquare. In contrast, though, there's little work on applications like Grindr and its equivalent that focus less on a check-in model, I'm at Starbucks and I am now the mayor, and more on making ephemeral connections to other people who are around you. As Sutko and Suzel de E. Silvas explain, I'm always going to screw up their names, I'm sorry. The brunt of literature on mobile phones generally highlights the capacity for these technologies to reinforce bonds between existing ties, but that we might be witnessing a social shift towards the ability for location-aware media to help build and connect with new ties. And what's not to love? Grindr a week ago announced that they've suddenly hit 4 million users, and as my blogger friend Zach Rosen wrote at The New Gay, Grindr equates to the biggest change in gay hookups since the Hinky Code. So let's look at how this thing works. This is the main screen of Grindr. It's what Grindr refers to as the cascade. Each of these individuals represents someone who's on the system and presumably available to talk to you right now. If they've been online within the last 10 minutes, look at a little green dot. You can see that people are sending messages here. And it's ordered it's ordered by rank of proximity. How close is that person to you? Closer to the top, closer to you, conceivably easier to interact with. Profiles are generally simple. You tap on one of these, you get to David, who you know, was there smiling. They're simple, but notably, the profile image serves a very central role in profiles. And then there's this part that people seem to love, 463 feet away. These people are typically much closer to you than you might imagine. Once you click on the chat, you get something that looks like an IM conversation where people can swap images that are not moderated by any entity, and exchange locations, such as this. Apparently, David might be hooking up with someone, indeed, at the Googleplex. There's not much work on Grindr, but I do want to point to 3 articles that generally think about Grindr in terms of the visualities that it enables. Malabakis talks about Grindr as a form of digital cruising. Tinkham talks about Grindr in relationship to the circulation of the erotic. He's a media studies scholar. And then finally, in a conference paper, Schwartz talks about the relationship that Grindr has in enabling local queerness among rural gay youth. So This is not to suggest that I'm going to be speaking to all these issues, but it's rather to highlight how, as a piece of technology, Grindr raises a lot of questions about across a variety of disciplines and interests. But with all this attention and excitement, and Grindr helping people to ostensibly arrive at their next date or tryst, we went ahead and asked the most obvious question: why do people leave? The existing research on non-use, while small, argues that if we want to understand the totality of user experiences, we must also study non-user experiences. Researchers, including Esther, hi Esther, have argued that studying non-use can provide important contextual information as well as explore assumptions about users and their use of technology. That said, we were kind of surprised at the dearth of qualitative literature in this area. Most historical work emerges as a critique of our biased focus on use. Notably, this pops up around topics of the digital divide, so-called digital divide, and technological diffusion around internet adoption. And while we were surprised about that lack of literature, perhaps we shouldn't have been. Because as Satchel and Dersh wrote, HCI has always had some kind of interest in non-users, but generally regards them as potential users. And as such, existing literature on former users, individuals who use a technology and then for whatever reason stopped, is particularly sparse. Now, I do want to mention one kind of non-use that has gained attention, particularly in the press and blogs recently, that of technology refusal. This is sometimes called infocides or media refusal, and was most visible when people a couple years ago started committing Facebook suicide through the suicide machine and whatnot. There is some emerging literature in this area that we were able to track down, all of it in manuscript form and hopefully be on the presses very soon. But I want to set it aside for today because this type of non-use is characterized by an active and often public display of technology refusal, what is sometimes called a flounce. Instead, we want to look at the more mundane and often unmarked departures. So let's talk about how we got these people. 16 men located throughout North America, engaged in open-ended interviews. They were narrative-driven. Average age, 43.6. And I would generally say that actually the range of ages was quite small for this group. 56% of them were currently in a relationship and had left Grindr sometime between 2 weeks prior or 18 months prior. Now, it's worth talking about how did we find these people. I owe much debt and gratitude to my collaborators. And we actually made use of kind of an interesting, I thought it was an interesting technique of avoiding kind of a bias that happens when you gather a recruitment sample, which is that I interviewed their friends. So I didn't interview people I knew, which I actually think I'm going to adopt in the future. I liked that a lot. In addition, we posted things on email lists, and when that all dried up, well, then Dana tweeted, and everyone showed up, and generally our participant map looked like this. As I said, 16 people. The numbers here indicate roughly the order in which the cities were hit, a single person in each place, with the exception of 3 in Boston, New York City, and Los Angeles. In terms of analysis, we used grounded methodologies in tandem with thematic analysis. This was done in complete collaboration with Mike and Kate. I know there's this ongoing conversation about the tools one uses when doing coding and whatnot, with people falling on software and non-software side. These are the tools that I use, some kind of good sticky flags and lots of caffeine. In the final stage of analysis, we reorganized our data around 3 questions that were derived from our original research question of why do people leave Grindr? Each of these captures a particular aspect of the stories that people shared with us, and actually allowed us to think about leaving from a really lovely sociotechnical perspective. I'm going to take you through each of these in turn, and then we'll wrap up with some of the key findings that we found. So, what are people leaving? Daniel here says, by leaving, I lost an app on my phone. I don't know, I didn't really put much value on it. I don't really feel like I lost a whole lot. It was just that kind of thing. I don't feel like I really lost anything, actually. This kind of simplified perspective on what these moments of leaving or departure were was actually really common throughout a study. And so in our analysis, we actually had to look at around these kind of simple initial explanations. During an interview, I would always start with this question. So tell me, why did you leave? And Be like, these simple kinds of answers. On the whole, I'm going to focus on just a couple of these, but on the whole, people explained that they left, that what they left was an application. They left a set of individual behaviors. This was often characterized as a waste of their time. They were using the app, it was interrupting them, etc. They left interpersonal interactions that they found potentially objectionable, and the expectations associated with those interactions, often to find the right kind of person. And finally, a few people left this, what they left is a form of media, aspects of which they found rather objectionable. So the way in which Grindr presents information, or the way in which Grindr as a piece of technology configures users, they found objectionable. So here are a couple quotes. Waste of time, David, access to a bunch of twinks that are only really looking to fuck. And then what we have here are some related quotes about why Grindr might be a waste of time. You know half the people on there anyway. And then from Jacob, it just wasn't what I was looking for. And look, if these people, what they were looking for often was either a relationship of some type, or that the right kind of guys weren't there. It's worth pointing out that there are some competing applications with Grindr that people feel better approximates what their sexual interests are, or the sub-community that they participate in, notably the bear community. So, how are they leaving? Most obviously, they could just delete the app. And that seemed really simple, except for the very first interview I got kind of refuted this. What we actually got when we looked at all of the stories of how people actually went about leaving was this complex scenario in which you could delete the app, but then there was also this profile, and I guess the profile was still there, and some people took the time to go in and anonymize the profile before deleting the app. And then some people stopped and thought about, well, there's this account, and how do I go about deleting the account, which is actually far from obvious. And then some people stopped to speculate about the big data sitting behind all of this. And even though they couldn't take any action on that, it was still an aspect of their overall usage. One thing that I found really surprising in here is that a lot of people didn't delete the app. As James explained, there was no active departure. I guess you do have an account on Grindr, but I've never investigated how to close it. It turns out to close it, you actually have to go to their website and submit a request to customer service, and they will get back to you at some point. But what I really love is this part of this statement. I consider things like websites to be more official in that when you're not using them, you close down your membership. But an app, I feel like our mentality around phone apps is such that we get them, we use them for a little while, and then we don't use them anymore. He admitted that he actually kind of still enjoyed having the app on his phone because he, liked whipping it out at these dinner parties where straight people were just incredulous that such a thing existed, and he would just show them like, oh yes, it does. And these stories about the ways in which these gay men would perform this techno-social aspect of their gay community to straight counterparts actually came up a number of times. Likewise, we had stories about people anticipating that they would return in the future. Matteo here talked about how he didn't bother shutting down his account because he anticipated he was actually going to use it in the future. He was going to be going abroad to study in the next year, and he said, it's not like as soon as the plane lands I'm going to reinstall it, but that he didn't want to be very rigid about this position. And this kind of multiple perspectives on what it means to leave and how one goes about leaving it perhaps was best captured by Jose, who explained that, oh, no, actually, he still used it quite regularly, and that, but that he had still left. And so he said, well, you'd have to tell me, how do you define leaving then? And he said, oh, well, Grindr's about meeting people, and I just don't meet them anymore, and so I've left. But I still kind of like going on there and seeing who's around and who's interested in me. So we see these multiple perspectives of what it could actually mean to leave. These all seem in line with the study Mainwaring did on people who had left ubiquitous infrastructures. He found that a group of disconnectors, people who'd often left the internet or given up credit cards or whatnot, favored what he called a selective and reversible disconnection, which actually opens up nicely to this kind of this kind of positionality to departure, rather than kind of a bit switch, like a you've left or you've not. So yeah, the range of these stories demonstrates the varied definitions and criterions that participants held, and in such stories we get this depiction of departure that has more to do with an individual's relationship to their goals and expectations in using the system than any kind of concrete, perhaps easily understood computationally definition of what it means to leave. So finally, let's talk about what the significance of leaving is. People talked about this in three primary ways. They talked about no longer meeting people. They talked about realizations they had as a result of leaving. And what I want to focus on actually in this section, since we can't do everything, is the way in which Grindr continued to pop up and play a role in their relationships, in their romantic relationships. So when I interviewed Aaron, a man living in Los Angeles, he talked about how he had left Grindr, but had subsequently started dating this guy, and that pretty early on in the relationship, it came up. So in a sense, having that conversation about Grindr was a way of to talk about exclusivity by establishing that neither of us were using the app anymore. I don't know what he was hoping to get out of our dates, what his intentions were or anything. So it was like a way to get us on the same page. He'd left Grindr, but Grindr still has this conception that it's a place for hooking up. And so when it came up, even though he and his now partner had both had these experiences, it became kind of a shared cultural reference point that they could negotiate their own relationship in relationship to. This actually contrasts rather interestingly with a story told to me by Aaron. Aaron is also lives in the San Francisco Bay Area and was telling me about an experience he had last Christmas. Aaron has been dating this guy for about 8 months, and but also happens to live, his two roommates are a committed couple, and they all went on vacation last Christmas. And while they were on vacation, his roommates were on Grindr, and they were looking, and at some point they saw this really hot guy, and they were like, oh, Aaron, look, here, check out this guy. And Aaron's like, whatever. And the boyfriend saw it. And then there was a perhaps predictable argument that ensued. Aaron said, I think that, the possibility that I would have been looking somewhere else, even just for fun, bothers him. Because Grindr carries with it such implications that you are, in fact, on there for hooking up. Of course, there are his roommates, which provided an interesting contrast. And when I asked him to describe what the difference was, he said, well, they've been together for a really long time. They trust that the other person isn't going to do anything. They're in a civil union or domestic partnership. And so, yeah, I think they just have that level of security and trust. What I found really interesting here is the different role that Grindr can play at these different stages in also different kinds of relationships. In the first story about the couple talking about their shared experiences of Grindr, it becomes this way for them to realize where the other person is in relationship to this shared cultural idea and to orient themselves likewise. But for Aaron here, we have this, for Adam here, I'm sorry, we have this story in which maybe Grindr wasn't discussed. And then individuals have to deal with the ongoing threat that this potential impropriety might show up. Now, it's important to know that there are different kinds of personalities, and people engage these things in different ways. But what I think the interesting takeaway here, and what I find striking in these relationship stories in particular, is that even though these individuals have left Grindr, Grindr is still very much present in their lives. It remains this shared cultural object, and in relationship to which people continually have to negotiate their own position too. And this is an ongoing process. So let's go back to those three questions. what were participants leaving? They left an application, a set of individual behaviors, these wastes of time, interpersonal interactions, and perhaps a medium as well. What is it? How did they go about leaving? Well, they left through a myriad of social and technical practices that, while circulating the app itself, in no way required that people actually delete or apparently even stop using, as we saw with Jose, that app. And as for what the significance of leaving is, participants, of course, were no longer meeting people through Grindr. And participants articulated some self-realizations. And Grindr continued to be this point of negotiation as they moved forward and established romantic relationships. So in terms of some key findings, leaving involves both technical and social acts. We see this, that app is there, but oftentimes the social processes of leaving and figuring out what that means for you in relationship to a partner, in relationship to a gay community, the Grindr population, was actually much more profound than just simply deleting the app. As such, leaving is often an attenuated process as well. People moving forward and backwards, slowly decreasing their use of a system. Had one man tell me that he didn't even realize he'd left Grindr until he had, seen the recruitment materials and realized that, oh, he never installed it on his new device. And so we have this kind of, dare I say, passive or non-active mode of leaving. And then finally, the act of leaving and the site of departure are bound up really closely with the user's location. When individuals talked about those interactions that they were leaving, they were typically bound to where they were at the time. And when individuals talked about possibly returning to Grindr in the future, it was often in the context of a new location. So it doesn't make actually sense when you're talking about leaving Grindr to talk about Grindr as a whole, but perhaps leaving Grindr in Chicago or leaving Grindr in Boston. Some of people's favorite stories and favorite experiences with Grindr were as a discovery app when they were in a new location. I want to finish with a kind of high-level implication that I would suggest and invite some feedback on for studying non-use more broadly. And that is that we need to look beyond technology as a singular point of departure and focus instead on the relational possibilities and the spatial arrangements within and around which people move. And that thinking about leaving not as that on or off, but actually as this process of movement and really leveraging that notion of spatiality that that word gives us, that we can start to think about how people move inside of a network and how that network can then also, as we saw in the case of relationships, pull them back into a relationship with Grindr where they once again will have to renegotiate what it means to have left. So thank you guys.
One of the questions that I'm curious about, one of the things I'm curious about is the degree to which, I'm interested by the complex ways that leaving is not so easily demarcated, and yet the technical affordances historically of technologies that are like you're there or you're not. And yet the point about the apps of like, well, the app can be installed or not installed, the accounts and that nice directory. I'm also curious to thinking through the fact that a lot of different technologies actually go out of their way to make it hard to leave, and Grindr seems to be one of those where you have to actually write to the person. And I think a lot about Facebook and the idea that there's a deactivation that's different from the deletion, and these things. And I'm curious, and this is a very HCI question, but like I'm curious as you think about those design issues, how much you think that they're recognizing this amorphous dynamic, or how you think they should take that into account.
Yeah, those are great questions. So one of the things that I think is particularly interesting in the mobile app space about, and this is to the HCI point, about this notion of kind of resisting departure is that as I've dug into what it takes to leave Grindr, I've actually been surprised about how much information there actually is. Grindr has like this intense set of articles in their support knowledge base that talk to you completely through the process. But it's important to note that those actually aren't on the app. And in fact, one of the things that they say you should do is go in and anonymize that profile. When I talked to Matteo, he said that, when he decided to finally go to leave Grindr, he had already deleted his app, but he actually then needed to reinstall it so that he could anonymize his profile information, only then to remove it again. So, in terms of people designing these things to make it hard to leave, I don't know. I can't say that one way or the other. In part, I think this is because a lot of mobile app developers are on shoestring budgets. So instead of an active, how do we prevent them from leaving, it might just be, that's in the 20% that we can't care about. And that, I think, this is my speculation, but I think that's how I make sense of why Grindr, on the one hand, hasn't implemented code to make it easy for you to depart, but on the other hand, has all of these knowledge support articles that detail rather extensively how one would go about doing it. And with little advice like, to get rid of your photo, put your phone on a flat surface and take a picture to basically replace your photo with a black photo. And the rather detailed and perhaps inane instructions. But I would be curious to see where the disconnects are between the technology developers and perhaps, say, customer service.
That itself is a really interesting performance. The performance of leaving by the technical support folk, which is maybe different than actually what's needed to be leaving. I mean, that itself has its own manifestations.
Sure. I think there's this broader issue around this leaving that is kind of perpetuated actually more by how one goes about arriving. You don't ever set up an account on Grindr. It's done automatically for you. It snags the unique user ID off your phone and automatically generates out the GUID that gets shoved into the database, and that's how you're identified. And because there's such a light touch in the arrival to these systems, that may be contributing in part to stories like James, who talked about how it's just still on his phone. He just doesn't use it anymore. It's just kind of there in the trash heap. It's also worth pointing out, I found this out a couple days ago when my partner said, well, why didn't you take a screenshot of what it looks like when you delete Grindr? And I don't have this on a slide deck, but it's really interesting that it's the prompt for do you want to delete Grindr also says deleting Grindr will also remove all of its related data. And what it's saying is that it's going to delete the data that's associated with that application that's stored locally on the phone. However, this was a really big insight for me because when people were like, oh, I just thought it would automatically delete my account when I deleted the app, I was just like, are you crazy? But then when I 2 days ago or whatever it was, when I saw that message, all of a sudden it clicked in, and of course, people who don't think about the many, many layers at which their participation in the system exists are going to think that it will just wrap everything up and chuck it away. So yeah, thanks. Erhard?
Yeah. So I have two questions that are kind of related through methodology. One, I'm curious if you could tell us a bit more about the recruitment materials and how you went about recruiting folks, because as you describe in your findings, the definition of leaving is really fraught. And so I'm curious how you recruited people by asking about leaving.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about that. And second, obviously we're talking about a small sample size here of 16 individuals, and the age range has that average at 34.6. And I'm curious about how that may skew the data toward a set of findings around, this isn't what I'm looking for because these people are older and are looking for stable relationships. And so I'm curious about then what the younger users may be thinking and how you might recruit them, because they may not be thinking about leaving the same way if we're talking about these ebbs and flows of using an app or a social network as being tantamount to leaving, but they haven't left yet.
So first about the recruitment. I consider it actually rather serendipitous that when trying to come up with short, kind of easy descriptions of who we wanted to talk to, I used the word left. And I could have used quit, I could have used, screamed raging from the, my device. I could have used any number of things. But left actually had a really lovely tenuousness to it. And I think it invited a richer set of potential stories. So the recruitment area specifically said, have you left Grindr? And then said, if you're a man living in an urban location and you left Grindr within the last 18 months, give us a chat. We'd love to talk with you. So in terms of the ways in which that influenced the sample, you're right that it is skewing higher. It's not my understanding of Grindr's overall demographics suggests that it tapers off pretty quick after you get past mid-30s, at least in terms of what people report on their profiles. And so it does seem to be capturing that higher end. But I think as a broader point of interest, I'm not really particularly concerned about the empirical reasons that people would leave Grindr. Otherwise, I could give you a white note on all of the really crappy UI things that exist. And instead, the objective here was actually to, as Mike has been known to say, explicate a theory of leaving. In a space where we don't actually have a lot of work on what the variety of ways are in which people can go about leaving a system, the contribution here, I would hope, is not so much in what should Grindr do to fix their system, but how can we as users of social media, as researchers of social media, and of technology more broadly, think about what leaving means to the people we ostensibly care about. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I'm curious about the, even though that's not necessary to answer the questions that you're going for in your paper, I'm curious about future work in this space and how you might be going toward recruiting, a broader demographic or a more representative demographic of a user base with this problematic definition of leaving. I'm just curious about that. You could just, make stuff up right now if you want to respond that way.
This is a tad bit off the cuff, because one of the things that does exist in the current literature on non-use is actually a set of taxonomies about different modes of non-use, disinterest, disengagement, etc. And I'm reticent to produce a new set of taxonomies, which just like the use versus non-use kind of dichotomy, just creates another set of boxes. But it's definitely something to think through. I suppose if I was going to be doing a more specific study, let's say on Grindr, and I really wanted to dig into one of these aspects, I would do just that. I would think about what does leaving Grindr mean in the context of a relationship? And perhaps really narrow in on one of these particular aspects or one of these particular perhaps vectors that people are moving away from or towards an application, and really dig in that way. That's my off the cuff.
First of all, Jed, I want to say this is a really great project, and the paper
Thanks.
is very clear and organized, and it was a pleasure to read. I have a lot of line edits to you, but I'm going to send you a fun Word doc full of tracked changes. So I have one major question, and this is probably just me coming from my particular analytic background, but
Sure.
it really struck me that there's a complete lack of gender and sexuality analysis or theories that you're drawing from, and you're not talking about an app that's trying to show you how close you are to grocery delivery. There's a really specific type of sexuality and gender that's being interpolated through this app, which I think comes in a little bit when your discussion of visuality, and obviously Sharif and Raz in their discussions are very much focusing on that type of gender and sexuality analysis. And I'm not saying that every time you analyze a gay app you have to be like gay, 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 gay. I mean, I think that there's a lot of, you guys know what I mean. I don't think that has to be the center of every analysis when you're looking at an app like this. And I do appreciate that you're not coming from that perspective, and instead you're choosing to look at this from the perspective of leaving, and that is the scope of your project. So this could be a scoping issue, but I think that some of your results reflect the specific gender and sexuality that's interpolated in the app. And I think that by leaving that out, you are perhaps missing an opportunity for analysis that would allow you to situate your work within a larger theoretical framework of queerness or sexuality that might be quite interesting and useful.
I agree. I think one of the things I struggled with when trying to synthesize these results into something that was manageable actually had a lot to do with this notion of culture and what are the universals of Grindr. Something I tried to do analytically was to always avoid some kind of normalized notion of what Grindr was. The question, why do people leave Grindr, presumes that Grindr is a stable, coherent thing that, in relationship to which one can depart. And so that was the motivation for switching into these kind of three questions by saying, what is it that you have left? Inherently says, we're going to assume that Grindr actually is constitutive with your experiences. So when someone says, oh, it was just a total waste of time, what they've left is a waste of time. I struggled in the analysis in part because of the diverse locations and the diverse types of people that I interviewed to figure out how to appropriately represent issues around sexuality and what I think are some pretty fair assumptions about Grindr. Grindr is often conceptualized as a place for hooking up, but the very first person I talked to, is now in a long-term committed relationship based on turning to Grindr to find people to hook up with because going on Match.com was just too much pressure on a date. And so, there was this lovely process in this study of constantly having any assumption I had about what Grindr was and even what leaving was about be undermined. It does seem to me, something that's popping in my brain right now, that it seemed like whatever an individual's issues were or concerns were or anxieties were about themselves, particularly in relationship to the gay community, seemed to be inserted into actually Grindr as an ambiguous space. You'll never go onto Grindr's website and be like, hey, you want to find some good tail? This is where you need to be. And they're really good about find guys near you. And then in their details, it can be as discreet or non-discreet as you want. Share only what you want, etc. And so they had played up this kind of ambiguous space. And I likewise heard that in my interviews. But I was being cautious to not insert my own assumptions and sensibilities about what Grindr was as a universal into these kind of very localized experiences. But that's something worth talking with, particularly Mike and Kate, about some more, and thinking about how to appropriately incorporate that. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I definitely agree, but it has been a tricky nugget for me.
I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed the paper. You already have lots of line edits from me that I sent to the three of you. I think the first question I have is I'm not clear on are the three of you lead co-authors. So when you're using, so I'm just going to be hardcore and jump on your butt here. And that's all because I really love this project. So that's my first question. Who are you lead author? How, when you say collaborators in a presentation, because I'm going to just, this is for tutorial here, what are you saying?
I think it's appropriate to say that the stuff that I presented in this slide deck is collaborative. I would also say that everything in the paper is collaborative had it been vetted by other people so far. So I'm responsible for the words that are on this paper, but they are the byproduct of a project that was framed and shepherded collaboratively, and the analysis was done together.
Do you have an aversion to the word author? Are you using collaborative instead of authorship? I just want to make sure I'm clear on your terms.
No, I mean, well, if I'm understanding you correctly.
So there are different places in the paper and different places in your presentation where you're claiming what sounds like first authorship, and I just want to be clear if that's the case, or sole authorship versus co-authorship, lead authorship. I just want to be clear on that, because in my world, because I don't work in a world of the language of collaboration, I really want to understand you, because I think you do come up from that world.
Sure. So I will, let me clarify that. In my world of collaboration, there's often, particularly as lowly PhD students, a primary person collecting data. So the stories of I are about individual interactions that I had with individuals through the interview process. And I choose to use the word I particularly because my relationship to them and my experiences and the experiences they share with me are co-constitutive in that kind of ethnographic engagement. And so this, narrative psych moment here, but to the extent that I was adopting a first person in those moments, it's to honor what they were telling me. So I think I would make the distinction of interviewer or data collector is I, and then everything else is definitely we.
I mean, that's a side note. So I think to Alice's point, the place your paper really takes off for me around page 16, and there are earlier parts that are completely engaging and interesting, but around page 16 is when you start making this case that there's a negotiation that's happening, a performance with Grindr that is about a statement of loyalty or that a relationship's reached seriousness. So I feel like you've got a lot you can do in connecting to arguments in queer studies around homonormativity that really do seem central to the argument you're making. And earlier in the paper, you set it up initially as this is about gay men. I think that's another thing to push, either be explicit that that's how they're talking about themselves and be very qualified about the argument you can make, because Grindr does make claims about being for guys who want to have fun. It's very intentionally ambiguous, as you pointed out. And I think that ambivalence is something to note throughout the paper. How is that worked against, and how your methodology might have led you to very specific identities versus how the app is supposed to open up the possibility of behavior divorced from identity. So you've found a group of folks that may or may not, and I can't tell from your methodology, may have really specific investments in identity. And that's why I think what Alice is saying, you necessarily have to engage the literature around identity when you're bringing up those points. When you talk about relationship status, you're bringing up identity with the folks you've interviewed. So there's just a series of paths that are opened up that seem like they need to be addressed and all that. But I do feel like there's some really, really neat stuff you could do around leaving in terms of relationship and what that act is doing. The other, just quick side note, and I added some comments for your presentation, but when you are talking about, are you presenting social and technical acts as separate or entangled, and does one have more weight than the other for your analysis? Because if you end up putting, and you were tentative, and I appreciated that, around active versus passive ways of leaving, if those come to replace something like something distinct about being there or not, I don't know if that helps your argument. I don't know that you're getting that you're not working against your argument if you say there are passive and active ways of leaving versus leaving and not leaving. It just turns into a gradation that I can't tell if it's a significant gradation. Is that?
Yeah. So on that point first, that's something that we need to work through, work on the language a little bit. I'm not sure I don't like the active-passive thing. I don't know how to appropriately account for the, oh, oops, I never installed it on my new phone, except now in a complete realization at this moment as perhaps making the reciprocal argument that people having arrived at Grindr also have to continue to arrive. Which might be a way to acknowledge that you have to put it on the new device. You have to go back into the system. And that might be one way of handling it. As for the sociotechnical thing, I am a big stickler for symmetry, particularly when it comes to analysis of social actions inside of technological systems. I think that Kate and Mike might be annoyed at me always talking about that. But the one thing I found particularly striking here was that at least at the point of the app, there seemed to be some clarity about that technical action. And then on the social side of things, it was kind of this entire mess. But I have like diagrams in a notebook somewhere where like you have the app, and then you have the profile, and then you have the database, et cetera, et cetera. And likewise, you have decreasing use, a realization about self, leaving a particular set of people on Grindr, leaving Grindr as a whole, and then somewhere down there is a you know, now it's coming back because, you know, my new partner brought it up or whatnot. And so it seems to actually blow out in at least a visually nice way on both sides of that dyad.
So just last point on that. I think that links to Earhart's question about methodology, because if you are interested in getting at an explication of theory, I think the biggest challenge will be to qualify how your methodology didn't foreclose or shut down the range of what you could develop, because you're starting. It's sort of like starting a definition with the word in it. So logically, that doesn't hold, and so methodologically, that doesn't mean it means you have to shift your question a bit, because your methodology really doesn't support that goal.
I'd like to follow up on that, more about method. So I agree with the previous comments about how it's important to reflect on how you recruited people. I think it's definitely important in any presentation that you make that very explicit. I haven't looked at the article, but given how closely your recruitment method is tied to the questions you're asking, it's really important to understand what was going on. And I would actually, in the methods, then reflect on why it is that you didn't choose those other words. And I think Mary's right that there are limits to what you can walk away with about leaving, if that's the word you did use. Or, yeah, I mean, I think that part of the research design is really crucial, and I think does require much more reflection, and reflection at that larger level of what can you actually walk away with from this study about that question. I think there are other questions that to which the answers are less intertwined potentially with how you recruited people. I think it'd be helpful to hear a little bit more about what this app actually does or where it functions. You kind of in a throwaway moment mentioned that you were recruiting people from urban areas, and it's not clear to me if that's because it only works in urban areas or if there was some other reason, but that's, again, a potential methodological issue that you need to address, because actually one of my thoughts was when I read one of your quotes was when someone said that they already know everyone anyway, and I thought, well, that would depend on the kind of place you live in, presumably at least, as to whether you do actually know everyone who's on there anyway. So again, a little bit more context about who these people are would be helpful. And then just one more point. I would have found it helpful to hear about these people's prior experiences with Grindr, because, again, it could be a little bit of comparing apples and oranges if you're comparing a bunch of people who've used it for 2 days versus someone who's been on there for 2 years, and their reasons for leaving and the implications of leaving for their everyday lives might be different depending on that.
Yeah. Let me hit each of those in turn. In terms of the urban area issue, that's actually something that I hope I did a good job of covering in the paper. There's existing work, including Mary's, and actually Raj Schwartz's, who has specifically talked about kind of the metronormativity that exists when studying queer populations, that we tend to presume that the urban experience is the only experience. For a couple of reasons, we restricted our recruitment to people in urban places. For one, it's because these differences existed and we wanted to separate out as much as we could the very separate and potentially distinct experiences that are happening in rural spaces. This actually fits in nicely with that quote, which is about like, well, you know everyone on Grindr anyway. That's what I would have expected to hear from someone in a rural setting. In some other work, I've been thinking about the ways in which the kind of churn or flow there might be in the profiles. On Grindr, you're limited to, unless you upgrade to this paid model, you're limited to the 100 people who are most proximate to you. And so there's some kind of economic work going on there in terms of, who do you want to see and what spaces do you want access to. So I was actually really surprised when that quote actually came from a man who lives in Cambridge. And I actually don't know if this is a byproduct of the fact that people actually just don't move as much as we think we do. But it actually could be contrasted against a man I interviewed in Los Angeles who talked about being so excited when he first got the app that he was dangerously driving down the streets of Santa Monica, hitting refresh as quickly as he could to see the latest batch of new people show up because it was such this interesting process of discovery. But when you happen to sit down and text message, people aren't moving very much. And actually I was surprised that a number of people talked about just using it at home. So in terms of urban areas, we wanted to target where we felt like the app was designed for and really not address these, or hold for a later point the potential differences we might see in an urban versus rural. But even though I expected that then you would get this kind of constant churn, it turned out that that wasn't the case, which I thought was kind of interesting. The prior experiences is actually a really good point. I have that in the data. I'm not sure it's captured very well in the paper currently. But I think you're right to point it out. These individuals have a variety of prior experiences, and sometimes they're explicit and sometimes they're implied. And when I was mentioning a little bit earlier about the ways in which people seem to inject their own experiences and their own interpretations of the gay community or what it means to be dating into this rather ambiguous field of Grindr, those are the kind of previous experiences that they're talking about. Previous experiences is what was informing that my thinking along those lines. So yeah, that's actually thank you. That's a good point and a good point to return to in the data analysis. Have I exhausted? Oh, I have not exhausted everyone.
I just have one. So I had the rural kind of, when I read the paper, the rural versus urban was kind of interesting in thinking about kind of the different experiences and what that might mean. And then you talked a little bit about this in the paper, but I don't think it came into the conclusion as much. But I'm curious about the relationship, because you talked about the kind of waste of time category of one of the reasons for leaving. And I think part of that is linked to kind of expectations of why they joined. And can you say a little bit more about why someone joined Grindr is connected to kind of why they're leaving? And if I missed that maybe I missed that in the paper, but I think that's kind of interesting. They're kind of linked. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm on the same page as you. I was surprised, though, in these interviews that oftentimes people couldn't quite articulate why they had started using Grindr. They just kind of did. People would sometimes tell me that, just everyone was using it, and so I started using it, or, it was this new shiny thing, let's go see what it is. And I think actually that's an important thing to highlight methodologically, because their expectations sometimes were multiple and mushy. Like, I am interested in having sex, I am interested in having a longer-term relationship. Those kind of circulate in the space that maybe Grindr could help with, but it didn't seem to have the same kind of intentionality that perhaps joining Match.com does, where it's like, I want to get a date because that ad said I would get married. And instead, people seem to have this kind of, everyone was using it, it was interesting. And I think one of the reasons that this is the case is because, for all intents and purposes, Grindr acts as a form of gaydar. And so even for this the committed married couple that popped up in this data, the desire to see who is there and to see who is around you, what Tinkham then calls this circulation of the erotic, is attractive and interesting to people, regardless actually of the desire to perhaps see it through to some kind of meeting in person. In fact, the guy I interviewed in San Francisco talked constantly about how everyone on Grindr is just someone in a relationship because it's the Castro and no one's single here, and so they're all just these coupled guys in monogamous relationships just seeing who's out there. So the funny thing about Grindr is it is the byproduct of whoever shows up, and so the experiences really range from place to place, but tracking down specifically what people's expectations were of Grindr itself was a really tricky thing in the data, and people had a very hard time explaining or pinpointing that. So.
But I also think there's, so I think the gator I think is really interesting to kind of talk about, there's a sense of, I guess I can ad-lib, of a sense of, a community, or there's like, you pop it up and people are kind of self-identifying and kind of coming out, so there's, there's a kind of performative aspect, there's a community aspect, and so it's interesting to why people came in, say it's kind of, I had these expectations, although I might be able to articulate it, but then I kind of leave, but then I also kind of continually come back to it. So I think that's kind of interesting. I think you could maybe illuminate that a little more in the, about, kind of linking expectations with, I came in, I got bored, and then I left, might be something to think about.
Thanks, yeah.
It was really helpful that you talked about the married couple and their usage, because I didn't read that as such when I read the draft. I took it as this guy had been cheating when he went on vacation and then came back and deleted his app to hide the tracks.
That was only a problem when I was putting together this talk, which I was like, every way I kept saying it, I was like, it sounds like he's going away with these people and like his roommates or like what, anyway. But I'll definitely look into that.
Yeah, that was interesting. Because I had a question about that when I was reading the paper. But I had another thing that followed off of what Sean was saying, and something that Esther had made a point about was you had mentioned these other apps, right? That they may have been leaving to go to. And so that raises this question to me about what you were just saying, that their usage had matured and changed since they first started, putting the app on their phone and then, playing with it and seeing what it did and how that changed how their dating behavior was. And so I'm curious as to how that is connected to the leaving. So as their usage of the app matures, does that change how they see the app? And how their expectations change about what their app is, and what their expectations are about using any such device as something that they're using to get to a relationship. And so now they're moving to these other apps because it's not actually that there was something about Grindr. It's just that they've changed as to what they want. And so it isn't about leaving that space. It's about going to another space. Like if you were to just kind of shift the balance a little bit. So I'm just curious as to kind of bring out a little bit more about their usage trajectory, like their histories with these apps and how that contributes to their choice to leave, especially if you're seeing as some people are going to other apps and some people aren't, and those seem like very different use cases that need much more research going into them.
Yeah. When I'm thinking about the data that has loosely been clustered under the realizations, the kind of self-realizations that people had, it might be exclusively with people who had completely abandoned this kind of application. We've had a number of discussions about to what extent do these other apps, Scruff, Growler, etc., get included in this project, and in the name of trying to limit all the various things one can talk about, they hit the chopping block. But I guess a couple points. A number of people actually used, Scruff is the most dominant competitor and is targeted ambiguously as well at scruffy guys. Apparently this means all of San Francisco, but outside of San Francisco often means bears. Because you're new to San Francisco if you don't have some scruff. The man I interviewed from Ottawa explained that Grindr is not Grindr. The scruff is not for bears, but rather it is for twinks with beards. No, actually, I think he was no. That would have been funny. This guy was also the alleged porn star, so it's kind of an interesting character. So actually, it's worth pointing out that that a number of these people actually used Scruff before they used Grindr. Scruff was available on Android long before it was available, long before Grindr was available on Android. Likewise, a number of people talked about using them at the same time. So rather than thinking about I want to be careful when I think about how like their usage is maturing, because instead what seemed to happen was a kind of identification or a successful connection via one of these systems or the other, such that then one would exclude the other. And then it was really fascinating to hear how they would attribute that success or failure to attributes, technological attributes of the system. So one of the really notable things is that Scruff has a far more robust profile system. And a number of people talked about how like Grindr was basically, these are my words, but too ephemeral, and that there wasn't enough stickiness to it, that like it wasn't really good for facilitating good connections via the system itself. It was only good for like getting you to be in person really quick. So, for example, the guy I interviewed in Las Vegas talked.
Do you mean that in terms of sustainability when you said good? Like, so a sustained connection? Is that what you mean?
It might not even be sustained per se. Although it definitely is included in it. Sometimes it was about sustained, sometimes it was about the robustness with which they understood or thought that they understood who the other person was. So for example, the guy interviewed in Las Vegas talked about how on Grindr no one would ever respond to him because, you know, there wasn't really much to say. He didn't really know how to strike up a conversation. But on Scruff, there's all these interests and dislikes and likes, and they can be like, oh my gosh, I like that movie too. And then they have this shared thing that they can use to start a connection. Likewise, Scruff gives you a kind of dashboard that's not as spatially sensitive. So it allows you to kind of have a favorite space where you can kind of put people in a different place and have a kind of more of an inbox kind of approach to having connections. And I suspect that those design choices were made as a byproduct of maybe there being less twinks with beards than there are gay men as a whole.
Was there any community identity, like I'm a Scruff guy or I'm a Grindr guy?
Oh yeah, and actually Grindr 2 days ago announced that they're going to add self-identifying sub-community labels. Like you can go into the bear channel, the jock channel, and they like the fact that anytime that you step in and like top down create what these channels are is always kind of funny. Scruff has had those for a really long time, but I believe has actually been moving away from them.
So I hate to wrap things up because we've obviously got lots of questions, but I just want to thank everybody for giving really, really good questions for this paper. I think it's incredibly helpful, and particularly a big thanks to Jed for all of the work that he's done over this internship. Cheers.
Thank you all.